shocks will change in the future and how that's going to affect poverty in the future. And that's what we did in this work, trying to look at 2030, how climate shocks might affect poverty between now and then. And so we have this estimate at the global level, something around 132 million people in poverty in 2030 because of climate change. Those numbers are always very difficult to interpret, right? 132 million, so big. But I think here we have a good comparison point. It's more or less what we had because of COVID-19 as an increase in poverty. So between now and 2030, the scale of the impacts that we expect is comparable to COVID-19. And of course, I'm looking at 2030 here, so the very short run, while most of the impacts we expect post-2030, even post-2050. So that's a sobering thought. Another sobering thought is this map, where you see sub-Saharan Africa being the place where a lot of these impacts will be felt. And as COP27 being a COP in Africa and a COP for Africa, this is really something that we have to keep in mind. If you're thinking about poverty, sub-Saharan Africa is really on the front line. That's pretty grim. Let me turn to maybe a little bit more like optimistic part of this discussion. First, those numbers, they are not written in stone. We can change them. The first thing we can do is to accelerate development before those impacts happen. And the more we take people out of poverty, the more we take people out of vulnerability to climate change. So this is using exactly the same tool, but assuming instead of sort of a business as usual development, more inclusive growth, more development that build resilience. And you can see between now and 2030, it's already a division by 2 of those impacts that we can achieve with that. And a lot by reducing people's vulnerability to food prices increase, because food security, and it's in everybody's mind in that period, food security is of course one of the key to reduce poverty. But so development can reduce vulnerability, but not any development path is as efficient to reduce the vulnerability to climate change, right? Development needs to be inclusive. And here I won't go into the details, but it's the type of things that are really important are education and increasing agricultural productivity. It's really important to look at healthcare and access to healthcare, really important to look at social protection, really important to look at connection to markets, especially for rural communities. So it's not any growth that will deliver the resilience we need, but it's growth that will do that. The second thing which is really important is to have development, to have growth, we need to build a lot of things, and we really need to build them right. So all of the new things we build, be it a road, a bridge, a port, a building, needs to be designed not only for today's risks, but also for tomorrow's risks. And in our work, we have called that the resilient infrastructure opportunity because of the economics of doing that. Building infrastructure in a way that's more resilient increases their costs by only 3% on average. So it's more, but it's not much more. And every time we invest $1 in making infrastructure more resilient, we're saving $4 in avoided losses. So I don't know if we have people from the private sector in the room, but an investment with a 1-to-4 ratio is not an investment you let on the table, right? You grab it. And this is what we can do by changing how we design buildings and infrastructure for tomorrow's risks. So that's my first point, right? Development is key to reduce the future impact of climate change because poverty means vulnerability. And by making people exit extreme poverty, we also make them exit extreme vulnerability. And it means that any climate action that would lead to more people in poverty, to slower development, is just counterproductive, right? If the goal is to reduce the impact of climate change, we need to make sure climate action doesn't slow down poverty reduction. And that's, again, something to keep in mind in that very difficult period with the crisis and the COP coming at us. But of course, adaptations, developments, we can reduce vulnerability, but there are limits to what we can do. Climate change will continue, temperature will continue to increase until global emissions reach, I mean, I'm sure you know it by now, we have repeated it a lot, until global emissions reach net zero. If emissions are positive in the world, temperature keeps increasing. It's just basic physics. So we need global emissions to get to zero. And yes, rich countries, large emitters have to work first and more. But at the end of the day, all countries will have to act and do something to go toward low carbon development. So the question then is, how do we combine that with my first imperative, right? We need poverty reduction, we need development, and still we need low carbon development. How do we make that happen? I'll start with the wrong way of making it happen, which is to focus on emissions and just to try to reduce emissions. Because this is really not the way to go. The way to go is to look at the development challenge for countries. So yes, there might be emissions, but also there might be unsustainable public debt, might be lack of access to energy, congestion and air pollution in cities, lack of access to improved water and sanitation. I could do a very long list, and this list is very country dependent because some countries have different priorities. If you put all of that together, you start to see the synergies, you start to see the opportunities. And of course, I don't want to go through all of them, but I just want to flag a few of them, which sounds particularly important to me at this point. I don't need to tell you that solar and wind power, renewable energy, the cost has declined so much that in most of the world, it's now cheaper than any fossil fuel to create energy. This is because we have pushed climate action in the last decades, and the result has been innovation and has been those technologies which make today we have energy the cheapest in human history. So this is not a trade-off, right? This is just a chance. We did not have that 10 years ago. This is new. And this can really help us bring electricity to everybody in the world, something that we have failed to do in the last decades. And one thing is, this is not only cheap, this is also extremely well suited to reach the people we have failed to reach in the past. So if you're thinking about rural communities in sub-Saharan Africa, connecting them to power with big power plants and a long line and the grid has been extremely challenging. Now, with those technologies, we can have mini grids with renewables that makes it so much easier because we can start bottom up and build this national grid from the bottom up, which is much easier than top-down approaches that have failed in so many countries. I could make the same story with electric mobility. All of the things are just chances that we have to capture. So I hear a lot of people saying that developing countries have the right to use fossil fuel, and I think we can all agree on that. But it's a little bit like having the right to use landline telephones or fax machines, right? I would be much more asking the question of, can developing countries have access to the technologies of the 21st century instead of the technologies of the 20th century? Because there are barriers for those countries to access those very cheap and promising technologies, and we need those barriers to go so that they can capture this opportunity. I don't want to go into the details, but working with nature is cheaper, more efficient. We have seen it in so many countries. It can create jobs in rural areas. And we also have seen that efficiency is something that we can work on. So economic growth, at the end of the day, it's about using your resources better. It's all about efficiency. Climate action, reducing emissions, same thing. It's all about efficiency, about using your resources well. I want to give one example. We have introduced in many countries fossil fuel or energy subsidies to help poor people access energy. And this is great because we want to help poor people access energy. Just when we run the numbers, we realize that this is a very, very inefficient way of doing that. Because a lot of the resources is not going to help poor people access energy. It's going in the rest of the economy and in creating bad incentives to waste energy. So just by replacing those fossil fuel and energy subsidies with direct transfers, you can send the right signal to your economy. And if you look on this figure, you have basically the bottom 60% of your population who would benefit from the change. So you can really achieve the same objective, which is making sure everybody can have access to modern energy for less. And this efficiency, of course, is helping with economic growth. Same thing with carbon pricing. Let me take you for a minute in Ghana. We have been working on carbon tax in Ghana. When we work on carbon tax in Ghana, it's not to reduce emissions, right? The country has like tiny emissions. But the country has a problem with domestic resource mobilization. They have unsustainable debt. So they need to raise more resources. And if you compare a carbon tax with some of the more complicated type of tax like labor, income taxes, or VAT or others, we find that the carbon tax in that context is much cheaper to implement. It's much more difficult to fraud, so it doesn't cost you the same to just control. So it's just a good way of raising resources for the government at this point. So it's not, we're not making it an emission story. We're making it a domestic resource mobilization story. So when we put all of that together, this is an example from our CCDR in Turkey. We find that scenarios with decarbonization can have economic growth that is just faster than the baseline growth. But you see, we have like so many lines in this figure because what you get does not depend on whether you do decarbonization. It depends a lot on how you do it. And that's why I'm trying to avoid the debates, the very abstract debates about is climate action good or bad for growth? Because if you don't explain how you're doing it, you can't really answer this question. It's all about how we implement that. And this is what I will discuss now in the last part of my presentation. Except that something happened and I cannot move this anymore. Yes. So if we want to get all of those synergies, if you want to capture those opportunities, I think there is a first question to ask is, if those opportunities are so great, why didn't we get them before, right? There must be a reason. And this is a really good question to ask because this is how you identify the barriers and how you remove them. So this is really the right approach to think about those issues. I want to talk about 3 challenges. The first one is around the distributional impacts and the political economy. I mean, we all have been through discussions on energy prices, for instance. The big challenge is the political economy, right? Because what you see on this figure are the job impacts in Turkey for a decarbonization scenario. On average, the aggregate impact is positive. You're creating more jobs than you're losing. But if you're a worker in a coal mines, you don't really care that somebody has a great time in the construction sector somewhere else in the country, right? All you see is that you have lost your job and you have no opportunities. So if you don't provide solutions for these people, there's just no way this is going to work over the long run. So we can look at our toolbox. We have a lot of tools. We have education and retraining. We have active labor policies. We have social protections. But I want just to stress one thing, which is really important, is for the political economy, what people want is not a compensation. They don't want to lose their job and livelihood. Thank you. It's all about moving from the idea that you will compensate people negatively affected to developing alternative development paths with alternative livelihoods and alternative local projects. And this really requires to be able to mobilize the private sector, to create the conditions for the private sector to step in and to create these jobs in these new sectors to compensate what you will be losing in fossil fuel development or use. Second challenge is on financing. And Mahmoud talked about that in his introduction because it's so essential and it will be discussed so much during your COP in a few weeks. Here, again, I'm using examples from Turkey and Vietnam with these huge numbers, about 1.2% of GDP in Turkey, maybe 2% of GDP for decarbonization alone in Vietnam. And here, I think those numbers are scary, but the key is not to panic, because if you cut them into different pieces, things become much more manageable. Part of those investments will be just good investments in renewable energy, in transportation, things that the private sector is completely able and willing to do, provided that the conditions are right and that you have the right enabling environment. For some of those investments, the returns are there, but they won't be enough. So this is when you need some support with concessional resources, can be domestic, can be international. But again, you can get a lot of your resources from the private sector. And finally, there are things for which the private sector will not be there. If you want to help people losing their job in the coal industry, this is not something that the private sector will be willing to do. So you still need public resources to just manage the transition and help people being affected. So again, you can cut your problem into pieces. We have a toolbox, we have solutions. The last challenge is about institutions and governance. because many times we realize that governance issues, lack of strong institutions is more of a challenge than the economics. I told you for resilience, we need 3% more for the resilience of infrastructure. This is not a financial problem. This is making the right decision, being able to include all of the risks in the decision making and so on. So here again, we need the international community to help to build capacity, especially in the more fragile countries. I will go very quick now on just showing you a little bit of a, and the screen is pretty small, so you will have to trust what I'm telling you about it because you won't be able to read, but that's okay because you trust me, right? So one type of screening tool that we're trying to develop is trying to focus on the barriers to what we want to achieve. So if what you want to achieve is reduce congestion in your cities, reduce air pollution and reduce emissions, the key is to look at what makes it difficult now, identifying barriers, which can be barriers on the incentives, can be the lack of information or behaviors, or can be a lack of capacity. And once you have identified the very precise barriers that you face, for instance, in some places you don't have land tenure, and so you cannot enforce any urban planning. Once you know what the barrier is, then you can look at the toolbox and what are the measures that you can implement. And you can do that for all of the barriers. Some are linked to technologies. Maybe you need to make sure you can import the right technologies from abroad. Some are linked to finance, and some are linked to the political economy. But the point I wanted to make here, without having you through the torture of reading this slide, is the key is to identify your goals, then to identify the barriers, and then get the political toolbox action against those barriers. To conclude, I want just to leave you with one last idea. I'm sure you were all in the same situation, especially in ministries, right? You have your desk with a pile of reports. Each report has 150 recommendations. So you basically have thousands of things that we're supposed to do, and that's just too many. So I'm pretty sure that the key is really in the sequencing of this action, in the prioritization of this action, so that instead of 2,000 things, you're trying to do 5 things, but they really matter and they really make a difference. And here we're really trying to help through our analytical work, through our CCDLs, to help get from those thousands of things to the subset of really important things that needs to be done right now. And the point I wanted to make to conclude is some of these actions, you want to do them now because they are in synergy with your short-term development goals. They will help you with the debt, they will help you with air pollution, they will help you with developing new exports. Some you want to do because they are urgent. Because if you don't do them now, it will be much more expensive or difficult to do in the future. And by, I think, looking at all of the recommendations that are landing on your desk and thinking about what can I delay, and if I can delay, maybe it's good to delay, but there are enough things that cannot be delayed, are really urgent. And then prioritizing things which are consistent with the other policy goals, you can really have a list of things that can be implemented and deliver on development, deliver on poverty reduction, and deliver on our climate agenda, but all at once. So I really hope that COP27 can help with that, especially for the obstacles at the international level. And I'm really looking forward to discussing those issues because I know they are complex and there is no one solution that will fix all of that. And only by collective design of solutions, we can really make progress in that field. So thanks again for the invitation and really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephane, for a very interesting presentation. You gave a very good diagnosis of the situation of poverty and where it's coming from, that adaptation is imperative. We cannot avoid that. And that infrastructure needs to be built in the right way in order to work well in the future. But then the key issues are the how issues. These are really the most important. The success depends on the right sequencing and prioritization of actions, okay? And the how question is actually the most important. You mentioned also a bunch of challenges. One of them are dealing with the governance issue. One is dealing with the financing need and so on. In the discussion, I'm hoping to try and complement those issues by the rest of the story, really, because there is a rest to the story. For me, I see challenge number 4 that you did not mention. And challenge number 4 is all the support that needs to come from the international community. Everything here is related to the countries and what they need to do and be good and have a good sequence and improve your institutions. But what about the rest of the world? What about the debts that we are stuck with? What about the fact that we are not really responsible for the emissions? A continent like Africa is responsible for no more than 3% of the emissions. 20 countries in the world are responsible for 80%, and they feel guilty about it. The real guilt, genuine guilt. But this guilt is not translated into action in any way. So it needs to be translated into action. And this takes us, of course, into the finance and serious look at adaptation. And Homi, I'm sure, is going to get into a lot of these things. But I want to ask him, Homi, please, I want to ask you a question first, a quick one, and then we'll go into the hot stuff, because there are, by the way, 26 days left before COP27, which is very short time. So the time is kicking big time. And the question is, what are you going to do about all those issues? But the question for Homi first, and it's a quick one. I know that you're doing in Brookings a lot of studies looking at the experiences of different countries. Dr. Mahmoud mentioned actually Egypt coming up in one of the chapters. And I wanted to quickly ask you, from the countries that you have seen, which ones are actually following the formula that was suggested by Stephane in taking the urgent actions first, in looking at the synergies and the trade-offs, and sort of respecting this very nice matrix that he had at the end of his presentation? Which countries are doing this best and could be giving a lesson for the others? Homi, if you just say something about that before we get into the more the hotter stuff, let's put it this way.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Habla, and thank you, Stephane, for a terrific presentation. So look, I will answer your question, but if you allow me, I'll say a little bit about what's coming out of some of these studies, which I think is very consistent with Stephane's presentation. The reason why I don't just want to immediately go into answering your question is that I think, as Stephane said at the beginning, what he's describing and what emerges from all of the country studies is that we're really talking about a completely different, brand new development paradigm. And there's a recognition of that development, that there should be a new development paradigm in all of the countries, but spelling out exactly what that is still very much a work in progress. And, it was, it's interesting. Stephane was quite humble in the beginning, saying we don't have all the answers. But then when it comes to, presentation of solutions, there are very detailed solutions. But I think we do have to be really humble here. We don't have many of the answers, but we have the emergence, I think, of what a new paradigm might look like. And the first really important point about that paradigm, which he emphasized, is that it has to be an integrated paradigm of climate and development. And Professor Nicholas Lord Stern has I think been very clear. He says if we about climate and development, he says if we fail on one, we fail on the other. And I think that that's exactly right. And I think as we think about this new paradigm, the big thing that's happening is that climate is moving from being seen as just a cost, these extreme weather events, the impact on agriculture, all of those negative numbers that were in Stephane's presentation. For many countries, I mean, they're feeling the here and now of the negative impacts of climate change. But I think in lots of countries, there's now also a lot of discussion about the opportunities. And that's the part of his presentation where he suggests and shows that there are lots of high return, high employment types of activities that could be done if we were to, really take this on board. And the critical point that he made is that we are today in an era of very cheap power, electric power. It's never been this cheap in history. And I think all of us know that the correlation between the use of electric power and development is very strong. It's one of the tightest linkages. And so how do we actually get electric power to rise and utilization to rise in all of our countries? And remember, we're talking about something, Thomas Edison, lit the first light bulb in 1870. We're 150 years since the discovery of electricity, and we still have upwards of 600 million people without access to electricity. So we can't afford to continue to have these kinds of very slow diffusion of this technology. And I think the opportunity before us is that we can really leapfrog with this technology. So that's one, I think, central point. But to do that kind of leapfrogging will require quite a different development growth paradigm, because it requires a much more expansive and developmental state. We had fallen back into thinking about economic growth as being entirely driven by the private sector, and the best thing governments could do is get out of the way. You can't think about this kind of transition and transformation to a decarbonized economy without saying governments will have to play a much stronger role. They have to play a stronger role in the incentive and regulatory framework, and they have to play a much stronger role on the financing and investment framework, as well as on insurance. That's going to cost money. And so thinking about, how do we bring government back into this picture while recognizing the real weaknesses of implementation capacity is really important. And I suspect that in all of the countries we've looked at in our studies, this issue of state implementation capacity comes back again and again and again. And it's both on the technology side. Can we choose the right projects? Can we plan them properly? Can we develop these so-called investment programs? And on the financing side, can we raise that financing? So the third observation I wanted to make is that, sometimes there's been this sense that somehow the issue of climate action is a luxury for developing countries. And it comes out to some extent. Why should developing countries have to, quote unquote, now clean up the mess that the advanced economies of the world have made by putting all of this carbon into our atmosphere? But what emerges, I think, instead is a recognition amongst the citizens of developing countries that climate is a really serious problem, and a recognition that they want their governments to do more on climate. Now, that priority for them is often on the adaptation side as well as on the mitigation side, but there is no question that it is people and citizens that are driving and pushing their governments to do much more about climate than the governments would by themselves. And I think that that's important. So, where is this mostly taking place? It's mostly taking place in all of those places and countries that lie between the tropics. If you think about that map that Stephane put about where the impact of climate action is going to be greatest, it's all concentrated across the tropics. I mean, he emphasized Africa, or of course, a big chunk of Africa is across the tropics. But when you look across the world, whether you're looking into Brazil and Central America, whether you're looking into South Asia and the rest of East Asia, the impact is really biggest in these places in the tropics. And of course, particularly for small islands in the tropics, it becomes an absolute existential threat. But it is the size of that impact that is generating this sense of scale, of urgency, of wanting to do things that can't be done by a single country by themselves. If you're a small island, you cannot self-insure against a major natural disaster event that, say, wipes out, in the case of Barbuda, 80% of their buildings and infrastructure were affected by a hurricane. You have to look to the rest of the world. That's the piece, and I think you were driving at this in your observations and comments. That's the piece that right now is severely lacking. We don't have these international mechanisms to try to really address some of these issues in an efficient and fair way from a global perspective. And so, when we think about these things, what people will say is it's all about the transition. And this is my last point. This transition is huge. Think about some of the numbers that Stephane put up at the end of his presentation. He says we need a couple of percent for mitigation and a couple of percent for adaptation, and then you've got the development agenda as well. But at the end of the day, he was talking about, well, what comes up from the external side? Maybe 1% of GDP, whereas from the domestic side, you're talking about 6 to 7% of GDP. Well, the simple arithmetic is that if you have investments or spending on these kinds of things of 7% of GDP and only 1% comes from external, you have to increase your domestic savings by about 6% of GDP, and that means reducing consumption. How are you going to effectively reduce your consumption today by 6% of GDP without having all of these negative impacts on the poorest people? So thinking about these transitions and these intertemporal transitions is hugely important. And that's where, in my mind, the rest of the world has to do much, much more if they want to bring some of these countries along with them. And that's why in the NDCs that countries have put on the table, you see this huge gap between the amount that they are able to do, as they say, in an unconditional way, and what they're able to do and prepared to do conditional on getting more support from the international community. Thank you.
Thank you, Homi, for this excellent intervention. Each one of the points that you mentioned is actually worthy of a discussion in its own right. The new development paradigm, definitely. The fact that the state needs to be involved is something that needs a study in its own right, because it's a very serious issue. Getting them involved is needed, but getting them involved how? In the right direction and without crowding out the private sector from what it's capable of doing is a whole issue in itself. And of course, whenever you look at a country, a developing country, and they have issues of hunger and issues of political conflicts and serious issues, when you have African countries in mind, it becomes a luxury, definitely, to talk about the climate, even though you see the actual symptoms and everybody asking governments to interfere. Okay, you have avoided nicely not talking about any countries doing things in the right way and others not doing it in the right way, but I'm gonna skip that. I want to ask you another question. I have many questions for you, and let's try to have the answers shorter so that we can accommodate more. We need to talk a bit about the finance. And again, going back to what I decided to call challenge number 4, and that's the international community's involvement in this whole thing. $100 billion are allocated for this on a yearly basis, and it's known that this is a drop in the ocean from what is actually needed, okay, in order to take care of the problem. And with the Ukraine war, a lot of the funds are already going in that direction, and COP is coming up Okay, so what do you see happening with the finance situation? Okay, and if I add something else, the catalytic finance is becoming a concern and something to talk about right now as a way out of the problem. But what do you see here, and what do you see the international community doing? Because it's one thing to say, hey, countries, save more, consume less, take care of the climate, it's bad for the future, when actually these countries fear that they feel that they are in a very unfair situation. You have the carbon market operating as a completely commercial market. It's not helping with compensation for losses. It's not helping with the climate change. This is not even tackled in Article 6. Okay, so what do you see about the finance? And let's try and be as focused as possible for time consideration. And then, Stephane, you are going to comment on the same issue after Omi is done. Please, Omi.
Thank you so much. So I think on the finance, we have to start to get granular. So Dr. Mahmoud said, we need to move beyond the 100 billion. He's exactly right. But what we need to do is not think about a single figure. We need to think about the different components of finance. So when we're talking about finance, we've got a certain amount of finance that has to come in a concessional way. If you want countries to decommission coal plants before their economic life is over, somebody has to pay and bear that burden. It's not going to be the developing countries by themselves. If you want more nature-based solutions, somebody has to pay for the services that are being provided for humanity. If you want to have compensation for loss and damage that is being caused by climate change, that has to be paid for through concessional finance. So there's one completely different type of funding which can fund a whole range of activities that do not have a revenue stream associated with them. And we need to identify that and separate it from the broader discussion of financing for, let me call it mitigation, largely, where you do have revenue streams. And there are a whole range of potential instruments. The numbers have to be much, much larger than, even the 100 billion that if we could get the 100 billion, it's a very good start. But frankly, we need to be thinking about several multiples of that. And we need to think about how we use our existing financial institutions, including the multilateral development banks, that don't have limits on their financing. These institutions can expand their financing using market mechanisms very rapidly. And the beauty of using the market and of using private finance is precisely that scale can be achieved. And so we have to think about how we use these institutions and how we broaden their instruments to include guarantees and other kinds of things to mobilize some additional private finance so that we can actually get the money into these projects. And we have to do this in a way that doesn't say, oh, you've already got too much debt, so stop borrowing and implementing good projects with high revenue streams. Instead, we've got to flip this idea and say, actually, the way to get out of a debt overhang is by growing more strongly. And you're going to generate that kind of economic growth if you actually invest in these kinds of projects. So I would, I think there are a range of things that can be done in order to do that. And just to come back, I don't want to duck your original question. Every one of these countries that we have looked at, South Africa, Indonesia, India, Egypt, others, are all saying finance is our biggest problem. We could move faster and do more if we had access to finance, both in larger volumes and on terms that are similar to the terms that exist in advanced economies. So it's very easy in advanced economies to say solar is the cheapest power because they can access finance on New York capital markets. It's much more complicated to do that in a developing country, but there are mechanisms using the international financial architecture to reduce that difference in the cost of capital and the maturity of capital to make these new projects much more affordable and put everybody on a more equal footing. Thank you.
Thank you, Homi. Stephane, again on the finance issue. Do you see possibility for having a change again in the carbon market structure? Article 6 is talking about the carbon market. The carbon market is dealing with mitigation very clearly, okay? But actually it's not contributing to climate finance, and it's not contributing to compensation for countries that are suffering from the emissions and have nothing to do with it. Do you see any potential of this happening? Any change in that direction?
Thank you. So, first point, I think I'm happy to add a fourth challenge. I think it's also useful to think of my three challenges as places where international community and international finance can help. I think we talked about how countries cannot face the cost of decommissioning coal early, for instance. This is something which is mostly a political economy issue, and this is something on which the international community has to do more. We saw that the agreement for South Africa, for instance, which still has to be translated into actual implementation. The World Bank Group is supporting for this type of work, but I don't think separating these two challenges is helpful. I think it's better for those challenges, which are domestic challenges, to see how the international community can help. And you can do that for the political economy. You can do that for the financing, of course, and you can do that also for the governance, because financing thing is good, but we also have to finance the capacity building, helping countries build the institutions they need, the training of people doing the work. So to me, that's a good way, because if you arrive with clear needs, it's much easier than to connect to the various sources of finance. In terms of how much we need, one thing that we find is that the additional needs due to climate are also much bigger in the poorest countries. So these huge numbers that was quoted, like if you need like 6-7%, it's in low-income countries. If you're looking at the middle and upper middle income countries like Turkey, you're much more in the 1% value, which is sort of a good news in the sense that the size of these economies make the whole global challenge more approachable. If you need a few percent of GDP in massive countries, it's much more challenging than if it's in countries that are very poor at the moment. My point, I think, is we did this work recently on this, how to use concessionality. Because I think what we would not want is, it's true that in many countries you have the cost of capital be very high. So something which makes sense economically, like solar power, becomes extremely expensive because it's all upfront costs. So if the cost of capital is high, you're in trouble. If you use concessional resources to help pass this barrier and to do one solar plant, while with the resources we have, we can do a few solar power plants, but this is not solving any problem for anybody. So the question is more, how do we use concessional resources to change the barrier, which is the point I was trying to make at the end. So if the barrier is the cost of capital, then the question is, how do we use concessional finance, not to do one or two projects, because this doesn't change the development trend, but to remove the barrier. And that is a lot about policy changes. So policy changes requires this support with concessional finance, maybe more than project per project, because with the amount we have, project per project, we just cannot do it. So, I mean, I think it's extremely clear that if we add all of the needs that we identify in those countries and the ability to fund domestically, there needs to be a huge increase in the support provided by high-income countries. And so high-income countries have a clear role to play internally by doing more to reduce their emissions and developing the technologies that other countries will be able to use. That's a very important part of what they have to do. Yeah, but no, exactly. This is what we see with solar power today. I mean, solar power is that cheap because people invested in it when it was really expensive. And that needs to happen for hydrogen, needs to happen for electric vehicle, it needs to happen for green steel and so on. But also income countries need to help for this financial challenge. And I will be in complete agreement with what was said on concessionality is one discussion, but the discussion on non-concessional finance is at least as important. So increasing access to non-concessional finance is a big challenge in a lot of those countries. So it's not all about those 100 billion, it's much more about the international financing architecture.
Thank you very much. The international financial architecture needs to change completely and look at the countries as having rights, not as this is not a donation to the poorer countries. They have a right to compensate a lot of what they lost. Shireen, are there any questions online? There are a few. Let's have some questions from online and from the floor, and then come back, please. Okay, do we have questions from the floor? Okay, please, somebody with the mic here, please. Questions needs to be quite short. Questions and comments need to be quite short, please. Okay, here first and then here. Okay, here, okay, okay.
Kindly, the question is, what can the worker and domestic community do for climate change and do to make the climate change a priority for their planning and doing?
Okay, thank you very much. Sure. Question here.
First of all, I want to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Magdi Fathi, the head of the Environmental Committee at the Egyptian Arab Organization for Human Rights and Development. I want to salute Mr. Stephane for his presentation about how to link between the human rights and the climate change, which is actually the core of what we're talking about. The question is, how can we, actually, there's the question on the table, is how we can move from the questions like agreements and all these kind of ideas had been brought on the table to implementation. This is number one. Number two, the question is how to raise up the awareness, because I think the awareness is the key word for everything, especially in the development countries. Thank you.
Clear, please.
I just want to highlight that why we don't think as one of the tools that we redesign the global value chain efficiently. So where it is not a donation, as you said, it is not a charity, it is using efficiently all the resources wherever they are. And science will lead, as Dr. Mahmoud said, to unleash the creativity. And then we need the finance for this, but based on redesigning the global value chain, manufacturing in the places where it is more efficient to manufacture.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask about the climate finance, and I'd like to ask, is it possible to think about establishing a new global fund for climate change, which contribute contribute in facilitating access finance for countries that can't access easily and can't access it with concessional loans? The second question about the global carbon market. Why there is standardization for the global market for all countries for carbon taxes and for also for ETS to be used by all countries, not to be different from voluntary and obligatory systems? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from the floor? Over there, please. We'll have two more questions and then we'll go for a round of answers and then come back to the questions here, or unless you're ready. You ready? Okay.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome, Mr. Stephane, in the institute. While I am making a paper about maximization of natural gas in Egypt, maximization value added of natural gas in Egypt, I read that there are now many very important technology for carbon management, like carbon capture, utilization, and storage. CCUS is very important, and converge technology.
Where is
you
the,
can
the
change
question?
carbon.
Where is the question, please? Where is the question?
The question that we need money to implement this technique. We need money in Egypt. الملا وزير البترول, he said that we face many challenges, like fund to implement carbon capture, utilization, and storage.
So point is clear.
This is very important technology. We must help all developing countries to use this technology.
Thank you. Thank you. There is a last question here. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi. So how can we actually trust the COPE after the funding, even the funding goal has not been yet achieved? So how can we trust the COPE's decisions as a developing country? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Questions here. Shireen has collected the questions that are online. Please go ahead.
I have quite a few. Pleased to confirm that we have more than 200 people online following us. And so we have more than 20 questions. So I'll start by 4, and then perhaps you may want to come for a second round.
We can collect questions that deal with the same issues.
I'll do it. We'll have 4 different countries, so we get that international outreach. The first one is from Zambia, from Rivan Firi. And my question goes to INPs. How should you ensure that climate funds distribution is done equitably, much more for the vulnerable countries and the coastal lines? And the second one related to also Rivan is kindly shed more light on how countries can do more to ensure that they achieve their national determined contribution, the NDCs, as this will be the main agenda for the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. And then they're quite, let me move from that to Dr. Atef Qobrosi. What about green growth, the circular economy, and the sustainable development? Who would and could lead this transition? Good governance is crucial, but more crucial is the role of government. What sort of actions and programs are left for government in the adaptation and mitigation? And he also has another intervention that deals with some serious economists have suggested and have proven mathematically that continued growth and dependence of technology would not save us from making the planet unlivable. Reducing growth does not mean that all countries should or could reduce their growth, but that the rich industrial economies need to yield space for the poor countries to catch up without compromising the sustainability of the planet. And I'll just take one more from Egypt. This case is Dr. Shireen Shawarbi. Stephane raised the issue of productivity and efficiency increase, which is crucial for development, and raised the question of why developing countries could make what is needed before, but gave us no answer about what can make them now follow a different path and adopt a new development paradigm as called by Homi, a different path.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before addressing the questions to Stephane and to Homi, I would like to Mr. Sharif to comment, because some of the questions are dealing with this. What to do about the domestic situation, the awareness, what is Egypt doing about COP27 as far as improving our efficiency and our productivity? And I want you to be as brief as possible.
Thank you, Dr. Abla. Let me first, I want to comment, just 2 comments about the presentation. The first one is, I don't hear about the CBDR. You mentioned it, Dr. Abla. All Africa is responsible about less than 4% of the total emission. That's why if it's do lot of work and make it 0, nothing happened to the global warming. But there is a problem, a real problem, to implement in a way for adaptation. When you talk about carbon taxes, who will pay for carbon taxes? Where is the social dimension of carbon taxes for the poor countries? The end user will pay it, right? This is 2 comments, but I want to hear about your point of view about it. In a way, for what we are doing for COP27, we are now working very hard. We have a lot of thematic days in the COP. We have lots of initiatives, and we have a website and all of this information posted on it. And in the regard of our institutional and the way what we are dealing with climate change in Egypt, since 2019, we established a climate change council headed by His Excellency Prime Minister, and we published our climate change strategy. We update our NDC, and all of this published on the website. And we are now updating our low emission development strategy. We have one until 2030, and we are now updating into 2050. But I want to hear from you the 2 questions I raised before.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. There is a lot that's happening in Egypt. For those of you who want to know, there is an action agenda, huge, that's going to be implemented in COP27. The thematic days, as Mr. Sharif mentioned, each day is dealing with a specific theme, with lots of events discussing water, gender, agriculture, etc. So they have these. They also have a bunch of specific initiatives, projects that are being presented and expanded to Africa, like in the case of Haya Karima, Decent Life. It's going to be implemented in Africa as well. Egypt also has, I think, 6 presidential tables that are going to discuss specific topics. 90 presidents will be coming to Egypt to attend these and have a discussion, because you cannot have officials discussing behind closed doors what needs to be done without having the political support from the leaders. So this is also taking place. There is a lot happening on the green camp of Egypt. But let's go back again to the questions. And the questions, if we are to put them, we collect them. If we are to collect them, okay, they're all about equity, okay, all right? They are all about trust in COP. And if you notice, a very young person is the one who mentioned it. Young people do not trust anybody at this point. I think let us do it. You've been messing up from 2015, the Paris Agreement. You've been talking about let us implement, let us do it. Then it took 6 years to negotiate. Now it's time to implement. What are you going to do with the implementation? Is it just following what happened in Glasgow and complete this, or do a lot more and come up with innovative ideas? And then there is, of course, the key issue of globally changing the entire value chain to become more efficient. It's not on the developing countries. It should not be on the developing countries. It's on everybody in a fair way. And fair is the key word. Who's going to pay for the taxes, for the carbon tax? So go ahead, and then I will have Homi also answer some of the questions.
Thank you. All of easy. So first, let me touch on this question of historical responsibility, because it also, I mean, it goes beyond the fact that today the world is a very unequal place, and the carbon world is a very unequal place, with emissions that are really ranging from nothing to huge amounts, not only across countries, but also within countries across people. So I think, I mean, this is clearly one of the very important discussions that will take place at the COP. It's linked to financing. It's also linked to how much different countries are acting on their own emissions. And within countries, it's also about how do we distribute those efforts. And maybe let me stop a little bit on Ghana, since you asked the precise question. In low and lower middle income countries, carbon taxes are very progressive. And actually, they are almost not paid by the poor because they mostly, unfortunately, use biomass. So in a country like Ghana, where putting in place an income tax is a huge challenge in terms of data collection, in terms of management, you have an alternative which is doable, which is cheaper to do, because especially for importer country, you just have to track the fossil fuels entering the countries. It's much easier, and that's progressive. And of course, in all countries, it's not progressive. If you look at higher income countries, it's not the case. And so it needs to be accompanied by additional measures to protect the people in poverty, exactly as we do when we reform fossil fuel subsidies or energy subsidies. It has to come with alternative solutions to help poor people access energy. So again, it's not a question of comparing in a country like Ghana or another, a carbon tax against nothing. It's comparing a carbon tax against alternative solutions for the country to raise the resources they need to pay for health, for education, and for infrastructure. So everybody in the world would like to pay less taxes, but when we have to choose how we raise resources, it's better to go for the most efficient and progressive solutions. And in some countries, it's an option. Without saying that it's a panacea. And in my list of barriers, one point that we're making a lot is that, yes, prices, taxes, incentives, and so on are important. But if you talk to real people implementing real projects, the list of barriers is much longer. And we come back to the role of the state. Who else is removing barriers? It's really the role of the government to understand what are the barriers to achieving our goals and to remove them. So I think it gives also a good guiding light on the role of the state versus the role of the private sector to avoid this crowding out effect. If there is a barrier that we can identify, it's the government roles to remove it, to help the private sector step in and do their share. But they won't be able to do it if the barriers are not removed. On paying for historical case, I mean, different people, different institutions have different roles. You know, the World Bank is not part of the, is not a party on the negotiation, and those very political questions are questions for countries and at the COP especially to discuss. So we don't have an official opinion on those issues, except that we are already very much acting on adaptation, but also on helping countries affected by shocks to recover, especially with contingent financing, what we have called CAT-BDO, which are tools that offer very financing for countries after they are affected by a shock. In the next 48 hours, the money is available for countries to help provide emergency services and deal with the urgency. So when we can, we play our part, but of course, there is a role for the international community and decisions that they have to make. One thing which is really important to me is to make sure when there are opportunities to reduce poverty, to improve development, that we don't wait for a great international solution if we can implement it. So getting to your point, Rwanda has an NDC with $5 billion in mitigation. And you might ask, why would Rwanda with minuscule emissions spend $5 billion in mitigation? Until you open the NDC and you look at the list of measures and you find clean cooking, you find environmental restoration, you find public transport, you find solar panels in remote villages, and you look at that and you say, well, this is not mitigation, right? This is just the development we like to see. So we have to be very careful that we don't wait to get those resources available if countries can do something to improve the situation of their population. I wanted maybe to touch on just very briefly on a couple of points, because I could spend a lot of time on those great questions. First, on the question of the role of workers, communities, and more generally the role of populations, right? This is a sustained effort that will need to last for decades. So this is not going to happen if it's just like one government at one point deciding to do it, if you don't have the consensus in the population that this is an engagement that's robust to political and policy changes and to the various events that we see happening in the world. So I think that one of the very important role of communities is really to have this discussion at all levels. And we see a lot of cities moving very fast, even when governments are not, because at the community level, you get this consensus and you can start to move. And this is a work of experimentation. As I said, we don't have all of the answers. So sometimes you'll have a city doing a great thing and all of the other cities saying, yeah, I want to do the same. So I think if communities manage to show the signal, show what works and show what doesn't, which is even being more brave to just say, oh, we tried that and it failed. Everybody's learning and everybody's gaining. So to me, that's really a very part. You asked about the global value chains. So, I mean, hopefully we start to see the global value chains reacting to the climate challenge. We see a lot of countries being concerned that their exports might be threatened if their carbon intensity is too high. We see a lot of worry also that this could be an additional obstacle for low-income countries, that they might have trouble to access markets because their economy is not decarbonized enough. So this is something to navigate with a lot of care so that we send an incentive, but we don't make another constraint on poor countries trying to access global markets. And we know accessing global markets has been a path out of poverty for so many countries that we want the rest of the world to have this same chance. One thing we have to keep in mind is especially the role of a few critical supply chains like steel, aluminum, petrochemicals, cement, because those technologies today are very difficult to decarbonize. And we know that when we build a new factory today to do steel or aluminum, it's better based in a place with a lot of renewable energy available. So if you have a lot of solar power in the future, you get an advantage for those critical supply chains. So we want to see this being taken into account by investors. That's one of the reasons why there is all of this work in the financial sector to improve disclosures, to force firms and companies to report on their carbon intensities, because the idea is that then investments will react to this information and go in the right place. And a lot of countries with a lot of solar resources, just looking around here, have a lot to gain from this shift. So there will be winners. And like always, we'll have to think about how we support the countries who have a business in those sectors and might be losing as we move. That, by the way, is one way also to develop utilization and storage, in the sense that countries with an expertise on that, especially oil and gas countries, can build on that expertise to develop those technologies and to gain a competitive advantage on other countries. There were other questions. I don't want to be too long, so you guide me on how much I continue, but sounds good.
Homi, maybe you would like to make some comments related to some of the questions that were raised, and before you do, just commenting on what Stephane said, definitely local communities have lots of great initiatives that can be scaled up and expanded upon, just that we cannot put on their shoulders the whole thing. Okay, it needs to be a lot more. Homi, please, you wanna say something? We're going to extend, with your permission, for 15 minutes because of all the questions that are still coming in. And because I also have a couple of very critical questions to you guys, I won't let go easily. So we're gonna have until 5:55. Homi, please.
Thank you. So let me just go into your quite helpful groupings. So on the notion of equity and the distribution of concessional funds, the existing system, in essence, tries to allocate concessional funds based on the income levels of countries. Now what we need to do is start to think about how can we also allocate concessional funds based on vulnerability of countries. That's still a work in progress. There's a UN panel that is looking at it, but I think it's absolutely fundamental to this concept of integrating climate and development. The other area which I think is gaining momentum is the idea that of, what in economics has long been known as the polluter pays principle. Fossil fuel companies, as we all know, have made record profits, especially recently. A relatively small 2% excise tax, on their revenues would, in essence, solve this issue of the amount of money. Now, politically, it's unlikely to be, done in at that scale and magnitude, but surely there is something that starts to implement at the global level the polluter pays principle, because right now we certainly don't have that. Your second bundle of questions was about trust. I have a very simple answer: follow the money. If COP27 ends and there's no money and there are no pledges which can be monitored and where people can be made accountable for, meaning they're sufficiently granular so that you can say exactly who is responsible for doing what, then it'll be very unclear what it will actually be able to achieve in practice. So if you really want to build trust, we have to just look at the money and the flow of finance. And third, all of these questions about the global value chains. There are two parts of the global economy which are very fragmented right now and causing huge inefficiencies. One is in everything to do with nature-based solutions. And Dr. Abla referred to this with the Article 6 and the voluntary credit markets. If the countries, for example, in Africa that are part of the Congo Basin actually got compensated for the what they generate in terms of services to the global economy, in terms of climate reduction through reforestation, the preservation of their forests. UNECA estimates it would provide up to $80 billion a year to those countries. So these are huge amounts compared to the amounts of aid or other kinds of finance which is going in. But these markets are not integrated. So at least right now, it's very difficult for these countries to actually participate in the European carbon trading system. So until we have an integration of those kinds of markets, it's going to be difficult to have the process become efficient. The second massive inefficiency in global markets is in finance. As I said before, companies and countries in advanced economies have access to finance at very cheap rates. And despite the fact that interest rates have recently risen, real interest rates, and more importantly for this discussion, the real interest rate represented by 10-year borrowing and 10-year money, those kinds of real rates are still extremely low. In all developing countries, including the countries that are most important for climate mitigation, real interest rates for those kinds of projects are at very high levels, sometimes at double-digit levels. And at double-digit levels, you will not get this huge buildup of renewables. So these are two parts of the global economy, essentially the globalization, if you will, of nature-based solutions and of carbon trading, and the continued globalization of finance that are going to be absolutely critical to making this agenda work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Homi. Back to you, Shireen, on questions. If questions that were not answered already, new questions. If you wanna take time to make sure that they are new.
There are quite a few that I've not mentioned first time round. There are quite a few, so I think I'll again be selective. And if you tell, I've announced that we'll be getting back to our participants online with the responses in due course. We have a question from Wale Ashraf, which is how the climate change affected on the political communication between countries. A question from Wasim Mina. I wonder if in Egypt we have a strategy at the governor level to deal with climate change, a magnitude of the problem, and a governorate level strategy to deal with it. We have a question from Noor Khalil to Stephane, indicating that Abla touched on a historic emission of a number of developed states and the lack of action on their part. Looking at a case like the recent floods in Pakistan and the call for repatriations, what is your view on repatriations to developing states less responsible for carbon emissions? Is this also a viable adaptation model? We'll take a couple more if you wish, from Zahra Abu Ayed. What are the most acceptable opportunities to be achieved recently? Continents of the world, especially Africa, to have success and make real progress. A question from Muhammad Diab. There need and must be unified global political will to affect the outcome of these recommendations into planning. How will this impact the climate change in 10, 20, or 30 years together? With the need to elevate poverty and growth as mentioned. A question from Hamed Muhtadi to Homi. Finance is critical, but access to international finance, such as, for example, to solar markets, requires a degree of financial development within countries that the very poorest developing countries most affected by climate change do not have. That is a huge challenge. Tell me if you need more. We have more.
Okay, back to you, Stephane. The talk about the loss and damage is obvious, and it's something that cannot be ignored. And what happened in Pakistan is a manifestation. So I will please comment on that, and then Homi on the finance part.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back briefly on the financing part, because we cannot make the economy of the question if some sectors in some countries have to pay 10, 12% interest rates. There are also reasons for that. And we can't just use public money to just give subsidies to pay 10, 12% if there are good reasons why they are 10, 12%, and those reasons can be removed. Because we're talking a lot about equity, but keep in mind that if we use public money to subsidize the financial sector to do that, I mean, where is the money going also, right? We have to keep that in mind. So as much as we can, if we can have reforms of the financial sector or the way the energy markets are designed so that we go from 10, 12% to 6% without having to throw a lot of public money that would be best used to help poor communities and pay for education and health, that would also be a good thing. So I just want to keep the balance right? We have a financial challenge, but it won't be solved only on the supply side. It needs to also be fixed on the other side to make sure we're not providing a subsidy for bad policies. So that to me is a really important point. I wanted also to react with a question about the funds. When you talk to governments, one of the complaints they have all the time is the fragmentation of the climate finance. You have like hundreds of funds, they all have different rules. If you want to put together a big project and you have to access all of these funds, just the resources you spend in just the paperwork is crazy. So I think it's important when we think about new instruments that we start by thinking about how can we use the existing instruments better. We have a lot already, and make sure we avoid making it even more complicated to access that finance. We have been talking a lot about small countries, small islands, poor countries. Those people have very limited staff. The Ministry of Environment might be just like a few people, right? They can't spend their time filling forms and so on. We have to facilitate access and not only the amount of money. That's a little bit the same thing. You asked about the carbon market, and I did not talk about that earlier. So the carbon market is something that's growing. We have much more hope in it than a few years ago. We also see the voluntary markets that are playing a role. At the moment, it's small, it's growing not very fast, and it's complicated to access. So again, I would link the two answers in the fact that those markets will play a role, but we have to look at access, at making it simple enough that it doesn't become something too complicated to manage. And I wanted to react to your point on communities. We should not put that on their shoulder. I mean, if you go to communities at the moment, you see people willing to act, right? I don't see people saying, oh, I'm forced to do that by whoever. I think at least facilitating the work of communities, helping them do what they want to do, it's first a way to innovate and to experiment. It's also a way to make sure the money is well spent. When we're doing adaptation, we're doing a lot of community-based adaptation where the money goes to a community, but they decide what it should be spent upon. And that is a guarantee that you're relevant, that you're not spending a lot of money in this big seawall that in fact nobody really needs. So I think it's another role of communities I wanted to mention. And on trust, let me start with a little poll in the room. Who thinks that we'll manage to do it? Who that will be at zero net emission 2050? Show of hands. Okay, so talking about trust, that is your problem. Okay, so I'm coming to high school students. You go to a high school at this age, they're supposed to be all like believing that everything is possible, right? You do the same thing, you get the same show of hands. Nobody thinks we'll do it. So my question is back to you, right? How are you going to do it if we don't believe that we will be doing it? Because we're always stressing those challenges and we're throwing at each other these big trillions of dollars that are missing. And in parallel, at the same time, you see so much happening in cities, in countries, and in firms with new technologies and so on. And that's basically, it's just everybody shrugs, like, it's just, yeah, well, if we don't have $4 trillion, we're doomed. And I don't think it's true. I think this is a step-by-step process that we need to build on what works. We are doing a lot to share across countries what we see working in some countries and getting the good results. And I think if you want to build the trust, people should feel that the objective is something that's achievable, right? And I really believe that this is achievable, right? There's nothing impossible in this net zero targets. But I think we have to think about also what this discussion does on people. Like, why would you organize your community? Why would you try to become the mayor of your small city if anyway we're just not going to make it happen, right? So I think it's really important to repeat again. If you look at, we know how to get net zero in 2050. We know the path. We know it's complicated. It's a lot of change, but there's nothing impossible in there. And I mean, we should have at least a couple of hands saying that we will make it, right?
Yes, it is doable if there is the if statement. If, okay? If governments are committed, if the international community is supportive, okay? And this maybe this takes me to the 4 questions and I have in mind, and because we are running out of time. I'm going to throw at you and Homie 4 suggestions, okay? And I want you to tell me how you feel about it, because this is the outcome. Yeah, take notes. This is the outcome of lots of talks, okay, that we've been having lately with a lot of people. One of them, okay, is that we call for a motion to cancel debt for a bunch of the developing countries to help them do exactly what you are saying. Do this and this and this. How can they do that if they are dragging debt all the time? If money cannot collected, the 100 billion cannot be collected because of the Ukraine war, because of situation, okay, don't pay, cancel the debt. So this is one motion. The second one, how about creating a fund to reduce the risk of investing in Africa? Okay, everybody is saying Africa is a victim. The rhetoric is lovely, and this is where the no trust is coming from. The talk is nice, all right? But how about putting the rhetoric into action and say, let governments from the 20 countries that are doing most of the pollution, the US on top, China on top, let's have a fund to support the investments by the private sector in Africa. They don't have to be as profitable as they dream to be. Part of this profit can be covered by that fund, okay? Out of duty and out of historical responsibility, not out of charity. This is number 2. Number 3, okay, that we call for emotion as well, to have adaptation goals, just like we have mitigation goals. We have very nice mitigation goals and we're sticking by them. Where are the adaptation goals? If anything, if you don't have a goal and if you don't know how to measure it, then you will never be able to do it. So how about that for emotion as well? And then the last motion actually is the heaviest. Okay, all what we're observing are symptoms of problems. We are not tackling the core of the problem. Whether we're talking private, whether we're talking health issues, whether we are talking about the poverty, these are all symptoms. The core of the problem is that the South, the global South, all these poor countries are not heard at all because the international system is not looking at them at all, except in a very minor way. So about having a new Bretton Woods agreement, one that is consistent with today's time. How about having a G20 that is different and that includes developing countries? How about changing the voting system in the IMF and the World Bank to have people, to have countries who have weight in the world now, and not just the financial contribution would make the vote, okay? It's where you are right now, the realities of the power game and the realities of the people's game in the world. 80% of the world is living in the global South and they are not represented. So these are 4 motions. I want your opinion on all 4 of them. And then Homie, I want your opinion on all 4 of them.
And as quickly as possible. That's so easy. So I think first that they're all very closely connected, right? They are not like 4 different things. And probably the last one is relevant very strongly for the 3 first. On debt cancellation, I think, so this is, you know, a topic that is being discussed quite a lot, the idea of debt swap, where you cancel debts in exchange for some commitments on the climate side, and then the idea that at least part of the resources will be used for some resilience building or decarbonization project. So there is a discussion going on. It's technically not that simple because of how the debt today is public and private. So you have like a lot of actors and the public cannot do it alone. You really need the private to be in the room. And how do we organize that is, I think, sort of an unsolved question. So you can have the public stepping in. At the same time, we have to be honest, like with the share of public versus private. If we have just the public doing that, again, it's just a subsidy, right? To not the poorest people on this planet, right? So we have to be sure to make sure like the right people benefit from what we're doing, because those are very complicated measures. On investments in, basically what you're talking about, I guess, is a fund based on historical responsibility that would go, I mean, you're talking about Africa, but I mean, small islands and the rest are also affected. I mean, this is part of the discussion that takes place at the COP, right? This is for the international community to decide of how these things are managed. What we are doing at the World Bank is to support the implementation of the things, but on those questions, we're not even part of the discussion. So I would stay on my seat in this one and say that having more resources to help with the development of those countries and to, especially on the resilience and adaptation angle, is of course something that we wish for, because then we can do things that we cannot do in the current context. On adaptation goals, I'm 200% with you. And the challenge is, of course, that we don't have a nice, clean metrics like emissions to do that goal, that it's complicated. But I think now we have published recently sub goals. So they are not like sort of an adaptation metric per se, but there are things that we know would really help. Like covering the population with adaptive social protections, that when something bad happens, it doesn't take 6 months to help them. You can help them in just a few days. Having something like in all countries, the right information on where are the different natural risks, so that when you build something, you don't have to pay to get this information, but it's with you. So all of the things we know are prerequisites for adaptation in countries. And we could build a sort of a scorecard of those goals that could be not as clean and nice as the mitigation goal with a net zero target, for instance, but something on which then you could start to track progress and also be held accountable, right? Because we would have a target and we could see if we make progress or not. On the global south not being heard, your last point, I think probably now is the time, right? This discussion is completely on the table. You've heard many people talking about it. So you have an opportunity in your hands. You'll have all of those head of states in Sharm el-Sheikh in a few weeks. The discussion has no reason to be only about climate. So I'm looking forward to seeing this conversation take place.
Homi, same 4 motions.
Thank you so much. So first on debt, I think that for public debt, there's already processes underway. The IMF have written a couple of papers demonstrating when debt cancellations and debt for nature, debt for climate swaps might be useful or not. There's nothing to stop it from happening right now. And is it easier to forge a generalized agreement rather than letting countries do it as and when they want? That's a little bit of the politics, and I'll leave that to Dr. Mahmoud to figure out. But debt cancellation is clearly a good idea and a good instrument for achieving the larger amount of concessional assistance that I think all of us feel we need. On a fund for investing in Africa, we actually have one. It's called the African Development Bank and the African Development Fund, and there are also a whole number of subnational, of regional, subcontinental regional development banks. All of these do very good things, and expanding them and building on them and putting them at the forefront of the climate and development action, I think would be a very good thing. But again, we don't have right now real political willingness to allow these kinds of institutions to perform at scale. It would imply giving them capital increases in the case of the banks and increasing the funds. So I think that you know, these instruments exist. I would hesitate to create new institutions unless we have diagnosed that the problems with the existing institutions are so large they can't be fixed. But the issue is not the lack of these kinds of institutions. The issue is the political willingness to actually allow them to expand and do more. Adaptation goals, I would say, are, as Stephane said, are process-oriented rather than outcome-oriented. I think that outcome-oriented goals are better, and I would submit that the Sustainable Development Goals already are there. And one of the things that we have now started to understand is that without adaptation, we're not going to be able to achieve many of the Sustainable Development Goals. Let's keep those goals the same, but add adaptation to our toolkit for how we achieve them. And finally, on voice, look, we have voice in the General Assembly of the UN. Where we don't have voice is on finance. It's very difficult to have a structure where we actually have, where you can get voice that doesn't, on financial issues, that is not in line with financial contributions. So, you know, it's important, but to be honest, I don't believe that this is the heart of the issue, because we have plenty of forums for there to be discussion, including at the UN. And the problem and the difficulty is that that voice might be expressed, but there are no mechanisms for formally translating that into action right now.
Dr. Mahmoud? Dr. Mahmoud, any final words, final comments on these motions and others? Anything on the session? Dr. Mahmoud? Is he in? He's muted? He's off camera, but we can't hear him. He's off camera. Okay. All right. I think our time is up. So let me close that session and tell you one thing before you leave. Again, 26 days left before COP. Okay. There is a big role for the civil society, for the scientific community, for everybody to push for so many things. We are going to have another webinar coming up on the 30th of October, and it's going to by the same group, the same gang.
There is one tomorrow. There is one tomorrow as well.
What? Dr. Mahmoud,
there is one we are organizing. Yeah, we are organizing one tomorrow with the World Bank, with the Nobel winner, Dr. Daflu, on climate and poverty.
In Washington, D.C.? This is going to be in Washington?
Yeah, that would be virtual. We'll send you an update on that. And again, very grateful to Steve Hammer.
No, please, thank you for informing us. And on the 30th of October, there's going to be one on the carbon credit. And please, do you have any comments to make on anything specific in what we talked about today?
No, thank you so much. I'm mindful to your time. I took notes, and then perhaps that would be reflected toward the end. Many thanks.
Okay, on the 30th of October, there will be more talk on the carbon credit, and very important, beyond the conference itself, Egypt is responsible for the COP up to the delivery to the Emirates in 2023. So there will be a lot more in talking and following up about what happens. Meanwhile, thank you so much for being with us, and please stay tuned. And I want to thank very much Stephane for an excellent presentation and a great discussion. And again, great thanks for Homi on the discussion, and you've been a great audience. Thank you so much.